the Secretary of State did. And so I called my aunt, who lives in New York, and I told her I'm going to run for Secretary of State of Missouri. She paused for a minute and she said, so if you win, you'll be in charge of like foreign relations with other states, right? And I was thinking about that because if that's the case, that's technically what I'm doing today. I am here on a diplomatic mission to Kansas, and I figured that if I can leave here and not start a border skirmish between Kansas and Missouri, then you guys have basically written a re-election ad for me. You know, kept the peace with bordering states. So I greatly appreciate it. In all seriousness, I'm excited that you're here because really what you represent, some of you were telling me that I think it's been 9 years since the last time there was a Young Democrats of Kansas convention. So what you represent is a bunch of young folks who are working on a weekend. So start by giving yourselves a round of applause just for being. That was a rather tepid round of applause. Yeah, maybe I'll get the next one. We'll try. It's coming up in about 10 seconds. The other thing I was going to mention is from the other side of the state line, I've had the opportunity to follow Kansas politics a little bit, and I have had the chance to watch the Davis campaign. I know that not only are there people from the campaign, I've met a couple of Davises while I've been here, frankly. They're not related, they want to make that very clear. But it's a pretty successful campaign so far. I think it has a lot of momentum, and so my guess is that the young Dems, the people in this room, have a lot to do with that momentum. So I would say, give yourselves a round of applause for the work. That was much better. There were a couple people over here who didn't clap, but other than that, I'm looking at y'all. No. But other than that, no, great, I appreciate it. So I was going to talk about a few things today. First, really, I think from a generational perspective, most of us in here, and I just barely do, represent the millennial generation. And I think that there is, not just as Democrats, but as millennials, a fundamentally different view about public service between us and Republicans. There's a reason that the millennial generation overwhelmingly has chosen to vote as Democrats. And I just think there's a fundamentally different perspective, and I think it's worth talking about. For me, that different perspective from the Republicans, that different approach to things, I think has a lot to do with why I was able to win a statewide race in Missouri. Not just winning it at 31, but I think it had a lot more to do with why I won on the same day that Mitt Romney carried my state by almost 10 points. I think it's about that different perspective, and I think that's what you all bring, and I think it's a refreshing perspective that people appreciate. And I want to tell you sort of just about how I arrived at my view of public service, because really, whether we're talking about Democrat versus Republican, or whatever county you're from or state you're from, it really starts with sort of first principles, sort of how you view public service. All of you are here because in some way or another you either want to enter public service or you're engaged with it already, or you want to do volunteer work. In addition to your job as an insurance agent, you want to work to make sure that that your state is in a better place than it is right now. That's public service, and you're already public servants. And so before you get into the partisan stuff, you just got to think about why you're in it in the first place. And so I wanted to start by telling you sort of how I came to view public service the way that I do. For me, it really goes back to one mission in particular from my time in Afghanistan. And I think about it all the time when I'm thinking about why I view public service the way I do. And on this mission, I worked with Special Operations Forces and with the Afghan Army to escort a newly elected member of the Afghan parliament from the capital back to her home. And the reason she needed an escort from folks like us was not that she pushed a radical agenda or made hostile statements that would elicit violence or anything like that. It was simply because she was a woman. And I have often imagined what it must have been like when she went to take a so-called difficult vote in the Afghan parliament. And I really doubt that she, put her finger in the air and tried to figure out which position polled the best. And I doubt that she cared all that much what one particular special interest or donor in her home district had to say about the issue. I choose to think, and I believe I'm right, that with everything she was risking to be there in the first place, she was just doing what she thought was right. And we talk all the time in this country, they throw it around like crazy on cable news now, about this term, political courage. And we probably overuse the term. And whenever I think about this term, political courage, I think about the fact that I have seen with my own eyes a politician who had to have real courage, true courage, just to get up and go to work every single day. And that's what inspires me to try to do the best job I can as Secretary of State. It's what inspires me to try and over again, regardless of the party stuff, try and make the decision that I think is the right decision, even when it's not the same as the easy decision. And that, I think, is sort of the first principle. That's what it all goes back to. For me, it goes back to sort of the lessons that I learned growing up. That's really what I was taught growing up. My dad was a cop, and my mom was a juvenile probation officer, both in KCK, actually. And so when you grow up and your dad's a cop and your mom's a juvenile probation officer, as you might imagine, you don't get away with anything at all as a kid. But in our household, my parents made this decision that they were going to bring kids into our home whose families were struggling. And these boys, I came to know them as my brothers, for lack of a better term. They didn't go through the foster system, but they were just my foster brothers. And the reason I mention that is because my parents never sat us down. They already had 2 kids, myself and my younger brother. And they never sat us down at the kitchen table and said, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Let's have a family meeting. They just knew that this is what the right thing to do was. It wasn't the easy thing, but that's what they were going to do. And so I'm sure a lot of you have similar stories from your upbringing about how your parents taught you about courage being doing what's right and not what's easy. And so for me, I remembered those lessons on 9/11. You know, a lot of you are a lot younger than me, so you were at a different place in school when 9/11 happened, but for me, I was in college in Washington, D.C., and so on that day, we had this feeling, like a lot of you probably remember, if you're old enough, a feeling of wanting to do something, an overwhelming feeling of wanting to do something. And the only thing that we could do that day, my roommates and I, to take action from that feeling was to try and go downtown and give blood. So we were in D.C., we went downtown, we stood in line for a couple hours to give blood. At the end of a couple hours, the folks who were taking blood came out and they said that they just didn't have the capacity to take any more, and we hadn't had the chance to give yet. And I still had that feeling of wanting to do something really badly. And up until that point in my life, I had always sort of in the back of my mind thought, maybe one day I'll serve. Like a lot of people, I came from not necessarily just a service tradition, but a sort of typical American family, in that my grandfather was in World War II, and my great uncle was as well, and my great grandfather was in World War I. That's not an uncommon story, right? My dad was a police officer, so I had this feeling all along, even before 9/11, that maybe one day I would join the military, and I would do it maybe after an ambitious civilian career. These ideas I had for a civilian career. And when they came out and said they couldn't take any more blood, I just kind of flipped the equation in my mind. And I decided, I'm going to go and I'm going to have a military career and I'm going to do what I think is right, even though it's not going to be easy. And then I will try and have a civilian career afterwards. And so that's what led me into the military. My job over there as an intelligence officer was in Afghanistan was to do anti-corruption investigations within the Afghan government. So I came home and I ran for the state legislature and I won. And I got to Jefferson City and I found out plenty of anti-corruption work to do in Jefferson City too. And I've just tried to continue to take that ethic, that first principle, with me to all the work that I've done, whether it was as a military intelligence officer, whether as an attorney practicing law in Kansas City, or as a state representative, or now as Secretary of State. I've tried to always go back to, before you get into the partisan stuff, just the consideration of, are you having the courage to do what's right instead of just what's easy? Because usually you can tell the difference. Sometimes, if you're lucky, sometimes those two options are the same, but a lot of the time they're different. And so I've been able to try and continue that. I think that has a lot to do with me being where I am now. But it's not really about me. It's not about the state where I'm from. It's not about Missouri. It's really about what we as a generation do, I think, in exercising those principles to move not just our party forward, but our country forward as well. Because